Welcome. Today we are going to learn about how to handle the disaster in your educational institute. Education institute is very important part of our country, as well as education institute is also prone to many of the disasters, and that time most of the people are involved. In education institute there are many stakeholders. Those stakeholders are playing an important role while managing any disaster, because the students are not in that capacity to handle the panic condition, handle the disaster condition. So the staff members as well as the school management or the institute management also plays very important role while managing disaster in educational institute. So let's see which are the very important stakeholder of educational institute. The important stakeholders or the resources which are available for educational institute are the infrastructure and the property, the students and parents, the teaching and supporting staff, the academic progress of the students. So the management of that educational institute, these are all of the stakeholders of educational institute. It means the infrastructure should be ready for the disaster management. The parents and students are trained to cope up with the conditions arising from the disaster, as well as the teaching and supporting staff is also to be aware about what is the disaster preparedness plan of the institute, how the institute is going to cope up with the disaster. These all things are to be in place for managing, for executing effective disaster management in education institute. Now, deciding a disaster management plan for educational institute, first we have to define what is the profile of that institute. What are the objectives and aim of the disaster management plan of the institute? What about the geographical location and which is leading to the predicting the disasters in the institute? Stakeholders view and how the stakeholders will be benefited from the disaster preparedness plan in the institute. Implementation of disaster preparedness plan and making the disaster preparedness plan if the institute is not having. These all things we are going to cover in today's video. For preparing our disaster management preparedness plan, for that time we have to identify what are the hazards and what are the risks involved in the institute. The institute should build a profile with a non-structural assessment. Similarly, you might aware that institute is newly constructed or its building is very old. So that time we have to assess the institute as an infrastructure for their structural capability, structural strength, and that strength report or that structural assessment report is giving us the idea about whether our institute is capable of handling the earthquake or whether it is prone to a damage or some hazard while if earthquake or similar natural disasters are taking place. Similarly, while developing an institute profile, we have to analyze what are the different hazards, different disasters which could happen outside of the institute premises. And if such incidents happen, how we are cope up with them, how we are going to face that incidents, those disasters, and how we are going to manage the after effects of that disaster. Similarly, while developing an institute profile, we have to analyze what are the different hazards, different disasters which could happen outside of the institute premises. And if such incidents happen, how we are cope up with them, how we are going to face that incidents, those disasters, and how we are going to manage the after effects of that disaster. For making a disaster preparedness plan, we require the past data of the hazards, past data of the disasters which have already happened in our institute or similar institutes which are facing similar effects of that disaster. Similarly, educational institute has variety of corners and the areas which are also has to identify whether that area is disaster free or whether we have a surveillance system available for that particular area. The disaster preparedness plan is maintained by the institute or the committee is formed to execute the disaster preparedness plan, and that committee has to make observation about what are the areas in your institute which is going to have some kind of disaster, which is going to have some kind of hazard. We have to execute a step in which we are identifying the hazards and as well as we are assessing the risk involved in each corner of our educational institute. Now, whenever we are identifying our educational institute's profile, we are coming up with the problems. We are coming up with some list of the hazards, some list of the disaster which could have happened in our educational institute. Whenever we want to take control of that disaster, we have to make a disaster preparedness plan, and for that purpose, we have to get started with making some teams. A single person can't handle all the work. So we have to work in team, and we have to develop some teams to execute, to prepare and to implement the disaster preparedness plan in our educational institute. For developing a disaster preparedness plan, we have to make some committees from our students, from our staff members, from our supporting staff and also with our teaching staff. So for the education institute, we have to form some committees. The first committee which you have to make, that is Institute Disaster Management Committee. The first and very important task of this committee is to make sub-teams where the individual team is given some individual and specific work related with disaster management and as well as disaster preparedness plan. Every sub-team will be having its task force, and that task force is given a specific task to perform at the time of disaster, before the disaster and after the disaster took place. Whenever we are making a disaster preparedness plan, we require some resources which will not be helpful for your institute when there is no disaster. When disaster took place, that time those resources are very much important for cope up with the disaster and handling the victims and all other stuff related with the disaster. Similarly, the disaster management committee has to identify whether there is an alarm system, whether there is a public addressing system available in the institute, or some mechanism should be there which is going to alert the student and faculties and the teachers as well as the parents and nearby authorities like police station, fire brigade and ambulance. So there should be a mechanism to alert the people at the time of disaster if any man-made disaster or a natural disaster took place in an education institute. Every institute should have its own evacuation plan, and that evacuation plan is not a general evacuation plan because every institute has its own way, own structure and having own exits and entry points which are allocated for students, staff as well as parents and the vehicles inside the institute premises. So every institute has to prepare its own evacuation plan which is going to helpful and which has to be distributed among the students, the faculties and the parents also. Whenever we talk about the disaster management, the very important thing which is missing in the education institute is the awareness. Means students are not aware about what are the steps to be taken. Faculty or teaching staff is also not aware about what are the guided steps to be taken if the disaster took place. Even inside the institute or outside of the institute, what will be the reference point for having a set guidelines for disaster preparedness? We have to have annual plan for awareness for disaster preparedness for the students and the teaching and supporting staff. Most of the people think that if you are doing it, you are learning it in a better way. So the mock drills are very important for executing and developing your students, your faculties, your teachers, your supporting staff with an attitude for prepare for disaster is the mock drill. So if you are conducting a mock drill in an education institute, it is going to help your faculties, your staff, your students to identify, to learn what are the things to be done after disaster and what are the things we should not do. We should avoid the things after disaster. Student may get panic and that time stampede may would happen. But if the students are guided in such a way, they are aware about it, that what we should do, what we should not do, that time the students will be assembled in a safe assembly area. So whenever we talk about the educational institute, we have to make a disaster management committee, and disaster management plan, disaster preparedness plan has to be developed. So we are going to learn now who are the responsible persons which will be involved in the institute disaster management committee. The chairperson is always a principal and the head of the institute. Similarly, the institute has some departments, so head of the departments will also be a part of the disaster management committee. The district education officer or district level authority. If there is a strong parent teacher committee or some parent teacher organization is there, so the head of that parent teacher organization as a member of disaster management committee is highly appreciated. So innovative students also be representing one part of the disaster management committee. Similarly, the district administrator, district administrating authorities representative also involved in disaster management committee of that institute. Similarly, at the time of disaster, what we require is a help from the outside agencies. So the fire as well as police as well as healthcare services has to be involved after disaster. So we have to make the representatives of the fire, police and health services as a committee member of our disaster management committee in the education institute.
ये YouTube चैनल पे आप सभी का स्वागत है। अगर आप यहाँ पे पहली बार आए हो तो हमारे चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कीजिए और हमारे सभी वीडियोस को पहली बार पाने के लिए बेल आइकॉन को हिट कीजिए।